Power to the people. John Lennon. Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vredos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College and Yeshiva University here in New York. Back in 1962, Tom Hayden and a small number of University of Michigan students issued a political manifesto called the Port Huron Statement that galvanized, captivated, and radicalized many young people and the country in the 1960s. It boldly stated that the imperative task for publicly disinherited and disenfranchised groups was to demand a democratic party responsible to their interests. The peace and civil rights movements challenged the so-called peace and civil rights credentials of otherwise liberals, threatening and running candidates against them. In short, they consciously built a base for challenging the loci of power, the two-part duopoly that the major parties of their time both represented and perpetuated: the policies of militarism, excessive materialism, structural racism, and poverty. The apathy felt by so many young people in particular in those days was at first subjective, a felt powerlessness, a resignation and cynicism before the enormity of events. Their participation in the political process and electoral voting campaigns didn't really matter. The results and policies would be similar, whatever party got in office. The subjective apathy of millions of workers, ordinary people, students, and others was encouraged by their objective situation. They were structurally separated as people from power, from relevant knowledge, from pinnacles of decision-making. The American political system was not the democratic model which its glorifiers wanted people to trust and believe in. In fact, the political system frustrated democracy, confused individual citizens, paralyzed policy discussion, and consolidated irresponsible power for military and business interests. The power elite, the prison, military-industrial complex. Today, 56 years after Port Huron, we again have a campaign of resistance, movements, and independent campaigns challenging the militarism, structural violence, racism, patriarchy, poverty, and greed of an America that is still grappling more than ever with many of the same issues and concerns Port Huron identified. Yes, of course, there are differences in the parties, but the overall trajectory is obvious. Both major parties have initiated and perpetuated wars and military adventures around the world, increased profound levels of economic inequality, unleashed ecological disasters, and created a society of moral bankruptcy and spiritual amnesia, non-accountability, loss of trust, and integrity. To any objective observer, the oligarchs of war and the fearmongers that cater to a culture of greed and militarism continue to exert their profound influences on both parties, as they've done through policies over the past several decades. The crucial question today is where and what form will all this political and moral energy take? Resistance, mobilization, and intensity of protest to the Trump regime have been unprecedented. The apathy that Port Huron spoke of has not materialized. The discussion continues among the great majority of the American populace who find their voices and aspirations stifled by the traditional politics as usual debate. What structures, organizations, and parties will evolve as we see the links in our various struggles? Our aligned interests and shared values go beyond single-issue campaigns. As Naomi Klein has put it, we need to lay out our yes. How can the progressive movement build independent power through a people's party? The answer to this question could well determine the success of the most important and inclusive progressive movement of our time. A new Port Huron Statement in the making. We're really excited to have on the Radical Imagination today a new friend and comrade who was at a Left Forum panel I chaired this past weekend on independent power towards a party for working people. He's L.J. Hawkins, a grassroots organizer, writer, and speaker on issues of race, criminal justice, and the historic black freedom struggle. He's a longtime member of Socialist Alternative and an activist with Black Lives Matter, and tours internationally discussing systemic racism, lecturing at, among other universities, Harvard, Hunter College, Oberlin College, Clark University, and the University of Toronto. Welcome, Algier.
Thank you so
to
much.
the Radical Imagination.
Thank you for having me.
It was great at the panel, and I just wanted you to be on the show and tell us more about your own activism and how it relates to the topic of the panel and the need for radical change. And so glad you're here. It's wonderful.
Thank you for having me.
Great.
I think for me, when I became political a number of years ago, first and foremost, I was born and raised in this area of East Harlem. So I know
El Barrio Fireplace.
Yes.
Firehouse.
Yeah.
5-6 blocks away.
Yes.
Right?
111th Street.
111th Street.
Between 2nd and 3rd Avenue. And growing up there, I was able to really be in a community where people took care of each other, in fact. It was the area where the Young Lords were doing their political activities in the late 60s and early 70s. And so I just grew up in a milieu with people that knew the struggle of just trying to put food on the table, to keep a roof over their heads. This was the pre-war on drugs era. And so really the community was really a community in many respects. So
fervent energy and a sense of love and
yes. That
provocative political
absolutely
education.
Absolutely. And that's as a young child. When I became political in the mid-90s and then being a member of Socialist Alternative, one of the first activities that I was engaged in was helping to bring about a Labor Party.
Tell us a little about the Socialist Alternative for our audience who may not know and be able to differentiate between the various progressive parties here. So how did you decide to join Socialist Alternative?
I was 21 years old. Socialist Alternative, when I joined, it was called Labor Militant. Back in the 90s, we're a national organization, and we stand in solidarity with an international organization called the Committee for Workers International, that's doing work all around the world, on every continent except for Antarctica. And basically, what we have done, we've been part of massive workers' campaigns, from various strikes to community struggles around housing and education, have had students within our organization. So when I joined in the mid-90s, I was really looking for an organization to help me not be just be a good activist, but be a thinking activist, to look at history, to link it to international events and how that feeds into our struggle here on the national level, but also how it feeds the work locally as well.
And you were going to John Jay College at that time, right?
Yes.
93, 94?
So I went to John Jay from 1992 to 1994.
Okay.
Tragically, my mother passed away in 94, but I was becoming politically engaged, very politically active. And I met Socialist Alternative in 1995. At a very crucial stage of my life. I was not a Marxist, right?
Okay, that's what I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
How did that?
Yeah, I wasn't
no traditions
Marxist.
in the family?
No,
nothing.
Traditional Democratic Party.
Liberal.
Okay. My mother was born in 1950, so she was 14 years old when Malcolm X was assassinated, and she was 18 when Dr. King was assassinated in 1968. And so when I joined the organization, I really had a very, I would say, an ignorant way of looking at Marxism.
Okay.
Right? I felt, it's a white man's ideology. It can't speak to the
How were you
struggle of
first
black folks.
exposed? You picked up Marx yourself, or in school, classes, or friends?
It was primarily within the movement.
Just
within the movement itself. A young lady asked me a question, I remember. At that time, I would have considered myself a black nationalist. And she asked me a question, well, what's your program for after the revolution will take place? And I really couldn't answer. I was stuck there. And at that point, I began to kind of look into the ideas of Marxism. And in fact, Marxism is really, first of all, this is a very interesting year because we celebrate his birth, 200 years, and then 150 years of the birth,
1818,
right?
right,
And the birth of the Communist Manifesto as well, the original publication 150 years ago. So in many ways, when we think of Marxism, it has had an imprint on multiple movements, but particularly within the Black freedom struggle, it has had a very particular role that I think a new generation is starting to recapture, resuscitate some of those ideas and concepts. Because what's interesting, Marx supported actually the Lincoln and the North winning the war, the American Civil War, the Second American Revolution.
Right.
Because he felt it was crucial in order to really end the pre-capitalist slave system actually that existed in the United States in the South.
So you're a Black nationalist, and now
Yes.
you add to that
Right.
your Marxist tradition.
Right.
Okay, and then you find yourself joining
A
organization.
very small socialist
socialist
organization. Right.
in the hopes of doing what?
Of
Politicizing the community,
Right.
Organizing workers around particular issues
Yes.
that you had seen in your own
Right.
upbringing.
Yes. Raising consciousness.
Raising consciousness.
Being involved in the living, breathing struggle of people either organizing in the workplace, fighting against slumlords, or being in the university and organizing and fighting back against tuition hikes or cuts to key funding for programs for students. And so for me, it was very important to understand what it really meant to be an activist, but also to be an activist that could think internationally, nationally, and locally.
And within the larger Marxian tradition of a workers' revolution.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
So take over the means of production.
Absolutely.
So that you were wedded to that notion and bringing that about.
Yes.
Okay.
And what's interesting for me, I was a Teamster really at the early stage of my political life. It was local 851. It was airborne, which was like UPS and FedEx, which doesn't exist anymore actually. But I was a shop steward. And I had 180 workers that I was representing on the shop floor. And we had a very abusive boss. And we were able, through a petition and through organizing, to get rid of our abusive boss. And that early victory in my political life said to me that these methods of struggle, of organizing, of agitation really works.
And you saw it in real life.
I saw it in real life.
And that's exactly what Marx was talking
That's
about.
right.
At the workplace.
Absolutely.
You could see
That's right.
the brutality and
That's
the
right.
discrimination and so on.
Absolutely.
And you saw it clearly and you were able to
That's right.
organize around that.
That's right.
Reality.
That's right. Right. Through a common interest,
Common interest.
but also
right.
common reality.
Right.
That I think that's how workers, that's how young people, that's how people in general learn. They learn by kind of putting their hands on a situation and have to experience it themselves to draw out the lessons and to raise their own consciousness.
Yeah. The books, the reading is important.
Absolutely.
But the actual life experiences and what you make of that.
That's right.
Raising the consciousness. Now, I don't want to skip a whole bunch of years here now, but we ended up on this panel,
Yes.
New Left Independent Parties
Yes.
and Strategies. So, but let me not leave out those years. So what?
Right, right.
So, what else happened during your growth here?
Right. The Socialist Alternative was active in really the attempt to construct a labor party. Historically, that has been the missing element for the working class, that it has never had its own.
In the city now.
In the city and around the nation.
Right.
Never had its own political party.
Right.
There were attempts to reform the Democratic Party.
Right.
There were attempts to form smaller third-party initiatives, like the Peace and Freedom Party out in California in the 60s.
Eldridge Cleaver.
Eldridge Cleaver, right, who ran for vice president, right? President.
Right. So you began very early on to realize
Yes.
the real impossibility of reforming or making gigantic inroads into the Democratic Party, making it more progressive.
Right. That we recognized that there will be forces that will want to do that. And when I became political, it was also at the end, really, or I should say the beginning of the fall of Stalinism. And that threw back a whole generation of political activists. You know, that history was over. that capitalism had won, and there was a triumphant attitude that the capitalist pundits and commentators.
It's the only ball game in town.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so,
Supposedly, yeah.
exactly. And also was the time where the Clinton neoliberal presidency really begins to take off, the question of globalization. And so at the end during and at the end of his administration, many left activists, many trade unionists in particular, were posing this question. It was after NAFTA, after North American Free Trade Agreement, that many activists were saying, you know, the Democratic Party and Clinton has betrayed really the working class.
Yeah.
And the labor movement
But it was
historically.
able to win the election, so that
Yes.
satisfied a lot of people.
That's true.
And so that, again,
Right.
bought off a lot of people that
That's true.
would have gone or could have gone to your vision, to our vision.
Yes, yes.
And so how do you, okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
And so when people felt betrayed by that, there was a segment of the labor movement that wanted to make it very clear that they would not be taken advantage of in this way, the way what NAFTA represented for the American working class, for the Mexican working class,
right.
and internationally. And so the Labor Party began as Labor Party advocates.
And of course, Clinton was very, very popular.
Very, very,
Very
popular.
popular, even
Yes.
after the attempt to
Yes.
impeach him. So,
Yes.
So you were up against this wave of
Right.
popular
Right.
opinion.
Right.
On one hand, you know, also understanding the conditions on the ground
Right.
was different than what
Right.
Clinton was talking about.
Absolutely.
So-
But then the Clinton model, because
Yeah,
he was
right.
able to do things that even a Republican could not do.
Yeah.
So if it not just NAFTA, it was the crime bill. It was 3 strikes, you're in, basically.
Yeah.
It was welfare deform, not
Right,
reform.
right.
And so it
Disastrous policies that
across
were
the board.
across the
That
board,
actually
which we're
has-
now beginning to realize. or
absolutely,
only in
and
the
it
last-
still have its effects even to this very day. In
Absolutely.
fact. Right.
And of course, Black Lives Matter. Let's bring
Yes.
your activism in there too.
Yes.
Were really the people that really confronted particularly Hillary Clinton and then later Bill Clinton.
That's
and,
right. That's right.
And he imploded
Yes.
in some of the criticism
Right.
on that, if you remember.
Right.
Again, you become involved with that as well, right?
Right.
Black Lives Matter and,
Yes.
and their in your face sort of confrontation
Right.
of what was actually happening on the ground.
Right, right.
In a way that really nobody else was doing. They had the real chutzpah, if you will,
Right, right,
to
exactly,
do that.
exactly.
And these were young people that
Yes,
were
yes.
standing up as pretty respectfully, but still
Right.
saying, hey,
Right. Right.
what's your problem here?
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, this was a generation that lived through the government, but also how the state really enacted the super predator term. They treated this generation of young people, of black and brown
Right.
people, like super predators. And yes, that's the famous
Exactly.
line by Hillary Clinton in her co-signing of the crime bill.
And
back
of course,
in
many of the
94.
black establishment politicians
Absolutely.
went along with Rangel and
Absolutely.
so on.
Absolutely.
And so I know we're talking a lot about a lot of stuff here, but
Yeah.
the radicalization of the young people,
Yes.
it's occurring more and more today,
Yeah.
but not to the extent, of course, that we were showing by Power to the People there in the 60s.
right.
So it's there. How can you capture that energy, which is certainly concrete and is there for the reaping, if you will? I mean, because as you know, majority of young people today are willing to accept or willing to entertain the notion of a system different than capitalism.
Yes.
They're not scared, as your mother's generation
Right,
was,
right,
of
right.
communism,
Yes, that's
socialism.
That's right.
And there's certainly the anger, the embitterment,
Yeah.
the polarization.
Right.
And that's, again, the topic here is how do we take that energy and what sort of structures can we build? How can we
Right.
channel it in ways that are not as self-destructive as some of the movements,
Right.
some of the things that were happening in the 60s.
Right, right.
But, yeah.
Yeah, I think with the BLM banner, for example, it's a life-affirming
Right,
statement,
right.
Which I think was actually crucial, because I think this generation, at the very core of this generation, will not accept any form of oppression, of subjugation, any denial of a people's humanity, and I think that's a very important step
It is.
forward. Capitalism is now the dirty word, not so much socialism. And people are investigating what is socialism, this idea of an egalitarian society where the resources are shared, where all your basic necessities are met, and that the possibilities of your own human growth as an individual, but as a collective, I think is very attractive for young people because they've seen capitalism for the last 30, 40 years. They've seen the individualism, they've seen the greed, they've seen the massive amounts of wealth going
particularly
to 0.1%.
in the Black and Hispanic communities, though.
Yes.
So it's still somewhat. In the '60s, we saw the counterculture was more the white middle class, although that began to diversify as well.
Right.
But do you see that same sort of intensity or beginning consciousness within whites, working class, middle class white?
Well, I mean, that was the charge against Occupy Wall Street. It was white, very middle class. But see, I think, and many other activists have said this over the years, other thinkers have said that when there are change taking place, it does not take place, at the root of say, for example, if you take a tree, it doesn't take place at the root of the tree. It's usually the tops of the leaves that usually when the winds are blowing, that they kind of indicate what is taking place. Occupy was the tops of the trees. It was that generation that believed in elements of the American dream. That if I
but
do
the roots are being strengthened, is what you're saying.
Yes, because the wind.
That's an excellent analogy.
Because the wind is swirling.
Right.
It's starting to affect everyone now. Certainly on various different levels, without a doubt. But I think what brings the commonality is that capitalism, particularly if you look at this era, I think we are living through a new Gilded Age, where massive amounts of wealth is captured at the top of society. But we're also seeing the kind of brutality of the state, of the police, of law enforcement, of the court system, and how they're making sure that the power, prestige, and influence of the 0.1%, the ruling class, the billionaire class, can maintain their power and their influence. And so you have these forces bouncing up against each other. I think to capture that, we're going to have to form new organizations.
And the ruthlessness, let's bring in what was going on in Puerto Rico. I mean, just the incredible callousness of the system and oblivious to the needs, particularly again, of brown people and black people and so on.
That's right.
And whites are beginning to understand that as well.
Right.
And connecting in ways that where our links will hopefully begin to evolve into a mass movement. But you say the roots are deepened.
That's right. And the organizations, any organization that we build, I strongly believe that it will have to be an organization that can speak to the interests of ordinary working people, black, brown, white, Asian, has to speak not just on a national level, but international level, that I think will be able to bring all that energy, that ferocity, the ingenuity of young people that have. I mean, we look at Parkland, for example, the youth of Parkland. I think they're not a finished product. From the standpoint of politically, they're going to go in various directions.
Absolutely,
right? The midterm elections are coming up. Many of them are going on this kind of national tour, certainly to drum up support for elements of the Democratic Party, but they will also be speaking out against Trump, the Republicans, and NRA. I think that's an indicator that the trauma of that day was just a springboard for them to become politically engaged.
They're searching intensely.
Yes.
And that gets us back to Norman Klein's argument.
Right.
We need to be able to present the yes.
Yes, that's right.
And
that's right.
Independent political parties?
Yes. I think that's on the agenda. I think 2016, the Sanders phenomenon within the Democratic Party, and certainly we saw the dirty tricks, and I will put it out there, the criminality really of the Democratic National Convention and the Democratic Party corporate establishment was very clear, because what the Sanders phenomenon really represented, outside of Sanders as an individual, certainly he played a role in this, but ideologically, the Democratic Party had moved so much to the right, actually, that Bernie was speaking of a heightened expectations of what working people should expect in a civil society, right? In a society that claims democracy, that speaks of opportunity for everyone. Absolutely. And what he was pointing out, what Occupy was pointing out, Occupy Wall Street was pointing out, was that in fact we have this new Gilded Age, and all the troubles that you're seeing on a daily basis is not because of your own individual inadequacy, but in fact it is from those in power. It's structural conditions. And so I think based off the Sanders phenomenon, but also other factors. In Seattle, Washington, in 2013, Socialist Alternative ran Shama Sawant for the city council. We won in 2013, but we had lost in 2012 again, running as independent socialists.
Could that happen in New York City?
I think it can.
I think it can too.
I think it can. The question is, and this I think is a key element to this, that campaign has to be linked to social struggle, to social movements. Has to be linked and have a program that speaks to the interests of working people. So for example, if we're talking about Medicare for all, if we're talking about housing, affordable housing, if we're talking about stopping, at the time, say stopping frisk, or
broken windows.
Or broken windows.
The continuation
policy.
of mass incarceration.
Absolutely.
In its various forms. Right?
Absolutely. And those campaigns will have to speak to that interest and organize in between election cycles. So if a political party is to be born, it will have to not worry so much about every 2 or 4 years, but actually do the work on the ground to advance and to extract reforms and victories, tangible victories. So working people get the moral confidence that says, hey, if we organize and we stick together, we fight back, we can win. We can win, for example, like the Fight for 15, which, say 5 or 6 years ago, people would have said, you crazy, that's not gonna happen. But through people organizing and also having its own political representation, like Shama Sawant in Seattle, Washington, was able to get the first 15 passed 6 months into her time in office, actually.
And go beyond that.
And go beyond that.
But again, we don't have that sort of that political structure here in the city yet, or do we? Or who would we?
We don't. I mean,
we don't.
We don't.
So it's still evolving, and we need that.
It is.
The charismatic leadership does play a part. I mean, obviously the message is there, and I think what you're saying correctly is that the great majority of people, as been the case throughout our history in a sense, want that.
Right.
But somehow, again, remember, I have to remind you, Bernie has not left the Democratic Party.
That's correct. That's right.
He had a chance to.
That's correct.
And our friend Nick was trying to
Nick
convince him of doing that,
yes.
Nick Branagh.
Absolutely.
And didn't happen.
That's true.
So.
But coming out of the Sanders phenomenon, what you have those, for example, the growth of DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, which was born in the 1960s, Michael Harrington. It's really an anti-communist organization, right? Very social democratic, believed in reforms under capitalism. But DSA today is a different organization, with various different strands of political thought and activity. You have a new generation, as I pointed out earlier, that socialism is not a dirty word. They may not know the full extent of what that actually means, socialism, but they are investigating it. Many of them are drawing conclusion. I want to be like Bernie. I want to run. Some of them are using the Democratic Party as a platform to run in. I would disagree.
Okay.
I would disagree.
You
with
would
them.
disagree.
I would disagree.
You got to be a complete. The marriage is
yes.
It's irrevocable. It's broken. It can't be fixed.
It's an
gone.
abusive.
It's dead.
It's an abusive relationship.
Okay. All right.
Right. And when you're in an abusive relationship, you must make decisions. Actually, and I think that abuse has to stop. One way it can stop is by declaring yourself independent, and to take that energy and say, you know what, let's build our social movements.
If it's so toxic and you're still working with it, that toxicity becomes part of you.
Absolutely.
And you get, taken over.
Absolutely. And people, I think this new activist layer, if you look at it, they are working class folks who are very genuine, actually. Who if you read their campaign, despite their running inside the Democratic Party, you read their program, it speaks to the very things that working people need, like Medicare for all, full affordable housing at 100%, a tax Wall Street or tax big business.
So eventually they're going to come up against that wall.
Absolutely. They're going to have to make the decision. Do you accept the demands of the corporate establishment within the Democratic Party?
Corporate Democratic agenda.
Yes.
Right.
Or do you say, I have program points that I think speaks to the interests of working people. I do not want to stymie that program. I don't want to eliminate
compromise that much,
compromise that
piecemeal. Even though a certain amount of compromise is going to happen, but you can't give up the bulk of the store.
So they're going to have to make key decisions going forward. I'm of the mind, and socialist alternative thinks that I think it's important to engage that milieu, that has this inside-outside strategy in
Yeah,
the Democratic
yeah,
Party, and ultimately say, hey, there's the Sharma Sawant examples, there's the Ginger Jensen, there's the Gail McLaughlin's, there's the Tim Canova examples of people declaring an independent approach. Yes, we may not win the first go around, despite politics and history is very interesting. It can history can take place in minutes that seem like it was impossible, can become possible
overnight.
Overnight,
in a sense. Yeah.
And so, but no matter what, if we're clear about what we want to do in building our movement, that should be able to move the conversation in a forward-thinking manner.
And let's move it as we did in the panel.
That's right.
And a lot of people on the panel, including Tim and Gail, picked up on it. Reverend William Barber, and I'm going to play a couple clips from him toward the end of the show here. But and you spoke very eloquently too of the importance of the Poor People's Campaign and of this moral integrity that he is now espousing and shows in every action that is being taken. So he's combining the political, and what about this overall moral vision?
Right.
It's not, again, about Democrats, Republicans, even left or right, even the Marxists and the non-Marxists.
Right.
You know, it's about right and wrong and hurting one's brother. Now, how do you bring that into this equation? And what do you think about that as a movement that really can unite us in some way? Not that necessarily he's going to run for office, but this energy that I think is growing every day, and I think is a powerful force. Right. How do you think this could be brought into what you're talking about? Well, or should it be?
Well, the original Poor People's Campaign, 1968, and this year is it's a very important year for the United States, but internationally, it was a year of struggle, of revolution, of counter-revolution all around the world.
We've had a number of shows on this.
Yes. And the Poor People, Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign, I think in many ways was born out of the inability of U.S. capitalism to really solve still the endemic problems of poverty, of racism, of militarism, materialism. And Dr. King, I think, in a very astute way, recognized that. You know,
and he unequivocally said he was a democratic socialist.
Yes.
He was, and he first date with Coretta.
I have socialist leanings, actually.
Yeah, socialist leanings.
Yeah.
Right. So.
Right, and I think from that standpoint, I think the work of Dr. King, particularly around the Poor People's Campaign, he began to see in his travels to Chicago in 1966, his travels to Watts, 1965, following the Watts Rebellion. Some people call it a riot. I call it a rebellion, or uprising, or social explosion. He began to see the northern reality of American society, of American Jim Crow, but in a northern context.
Which is even, in a sense, more destructive, if more hidden, perhaps, but even harder to work with. Yeah.
Absolutely.
He understood that.
He
understood this was going to be a monumental task here.
Absolutely. And I think he had broken away from the civil rights consensus, right?
Right. With the war, criticism of the Vietnam War.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. And Johnson, and
which Barber has done as well, by the way.
Absolutely.
As you know.
Absolutely. And
what I call for a strong peace movement.
That's right. That's right. That is militant, that is uncompromising,
right?
But also that creates bridges, right? That ties poor Appalachians to that
fusion politics.
Right.
Yeah.
More radical fusion politics, right?
Yeah, go into that. It seems like it's an extension of, in a way, your whole life. In a way, as you've described it here, as evolving into this. But go ahead. Yeah. What do you make of this fusion, independent fusion politics?
Right. I think, for example, I know we're jumping back and forth to many different things. Yeah. But around the debate around Trump care, for example, when Bernie Sanders goes into Appalachia and discusses with folks, many of them probably voted for Trump. And also many of them probably voted for him during the primaries. But he started talking about Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act and Trump care and the attempt to destroy that.
That poor whites are being hurt most.
Absolutely. And by the end of this of this televised event, this town hall, you could see that the crowd because the way he engaged the questions, the way he talked about the questions of healthcare and privatized healthcare and healthcare for profit.
Bring it down to earth.
Absolutely.
Concrete realities
Absolutely.
again.
Absolutely. And that's what I think Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign also illustrates. I think what Barber and the Poor People's Campaign of today is attempting to say, we have a crisis, and Dr. King pointed this out, a society that spends more money on militarism
crisis,
is leading towards a spiritual death. That you can't say that you're a society that's leading from the front, that talks about freedom and democracy, while your society has over 50 million people without any form of health care coverage, that has homelessness, in every major city, rural and urban. The United Nations at the end of this month will give a report about the conditions of U.S. society, and what they say is very scathing. To be the most advanced industrial capitalist nation on the planet in history. Basically, if you look at it, its infrastructure and the way it's treating its own citizens makes it no different than any third world nation that's led by a military dictatorship.
Absolutely.
And so the revival, this idea of bringing working people, the poor and the most oppressed together to demand.
Of all colors.
Of all
very
colors.
inclusive.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think that's crucial. I think that's going to be very important. The greatest fear that the ruling elite or the 0.1% has is a united movement of working people of all colors, because they can't use their divide and conquer tactics of racism, of sexism, of homophobia, of even elements of classism. And so that to me is one of the most powerful things that we can do in building our movement. You opened up with the question of SDS and the Port Huron platform. There was something else that was going on in 68 and 69, and that is the Chicago Black Panther Party, under the leadership of Fred Hampton, put forward the idea of a radical rainbow coalition of street gangs like the Blackstone Rangers, the Puerto Rican Young Lords, the Young Patriots, youth that their families had migrated out of the South and lived in uptown Chicago, and Chicano organizations to come together to oppose not just Vietnam, but to support each other in each other's struggle against the ruling elite and the political establishment of
International
Chicago. Yes.
Movement, although stressing the need for a certain solidarity among blacks.
Absolutely.
Black nationalism, in a sense. Or would you call it the same sort of thing that you grew up?
I would say an element of solidarity politics, but with socialist ideas. With socialist ideas, which I think was very unique of the Chicago Black Panthers.
Yeah, to the Panthers, right.
Right, and particularly
and
Chicago
Black Panthers. It was very threatening, obviously.
Absolutely,
That's
which
why
leads
it's
to Fred Hampton. Yeah, Fred Hampton assassinated December 3rd, 1969. And then the kind of that coalition ends. But the possibilities of bringing these forces together to politicize even street gangs at that time was very threatening.
And to talk about what you're referring to, and Barber too, and the prisoner rights movement, or ending mass incarceration, or Barber talking about how Jesus identified with the poor Absolutely. And the disenfranchised, and the criminals, in a sense, if you will. Right. So we learn more from them what is going on in the prisons, and the need to understand and have solidarity with their struggles.
That's right.
And understand that, again, they are victims of a larger racist structure.
Absolutely.
That
Absolutely.
we need to.
Absolutely.
Gosh, we've got only. This has flew by here. We've only got a couple minutes to. Right. I want you to make sure you got so many. You are an incredible spokesman, and just in your short number of years here on this earth have brought together so many powerful strains of political and cultural and thought. It's just amazing. Again, I want to really thank you so much.
Thank you.
But last minute or two that we have here, hopes for the future.
I think we're living in a moment where working people, young people, the most oppressed, are fighting for a way forward. They're looking for alternatives. And I think there are a number of embryonic developments taking place. If it's people running for office who have never run before, if it's the Parkland youth organizing, right. If it's young folks in the urban centers of our society, I think the ideas of socialism and internationalism and solidarity, from the teachers' strikes to kind of the resuscitation of the idea of workplace struggles that we haven't seen in a very long time. This is in the face of still a very reactionary, very bigoted, very racist, very sexist, misogynist presidency and administration that continues on a daily basis to really to erode the very hard-won victories of working people and the poor. But out of that, people can aspire to fight for a better world, a better future. I think socialism actually and internationalism.
And democracy.
And democracy.
And the answer to the part of this answer is more democracy.
Yes.
If you will, let's go back to 62, participatory democracy.
Right.
More of that.
Right.
Well, I very optimistic.
I'm ultimate optimist. I'm the ultimate
absolutely,
optimist.
absolutely. I hope our audience has enjoyed our discussion. This has been terrific.
Thank you. Thank you so
Jared,
much.
thank you so very, very much. And thank you all for being with us this week on The Radical Imagination. We'll see you again next week. And we're going to be closing with a couple of clips from
When love is the way,
Reverend Barber.
no child will go to bed hungry in this world ever again. When love is the way, poverty will become history. When love is the way, the earth will be a sanctuary. Dr. King was right. We must discover love. The redemptive power of love.
Presiding Bishop of the U.S. Episcopal Church, Michael Curry, took a star turn at the royal wedding last week. And this week, he's back to agitating for progressive social policy in the United States, staging a protest with other faith leaders on Thursday outside the White House. And joining me now are the Most Reverend Michael Curry, presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, and our good friend, Bishop William Barber, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. Bishops both, gentlemen, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joy.
So Bishop Curry, and my pastor in Miami was named Bishop Curry too, so I always smile when I say Bishop Curry. So it's great to meet you. Your speech, your sermon at the royal wedding was so moving and so inspiring and so unexpected. Did you give them any sense of what you were going to say before you took to that pulpit?
Oh, yes. I actually submitted a manuscript a week before. Now, anybody who knows a preacher knows that a manuscript is a wonderful outline, but I stuck to the basics of the outline, but I did. I submitted that, and they were very gracious and very kind and gave me the freedom to say what I thought and prayed God would want me to say.
And one of the things that did strike me about it is that your meditation on the importance of caring for the poor sounded very familiar to me because of the gentleman sitting next to you. Bishop William Barber has been talking about centering poverty and centering the poor, and that's been the core of the message of the Moral Mondays campaign and the current Poor People's Campaign. Why, Bishop Curry, do you think it is important at this time to recenter the poor, and why take that message to the White House?
Well, it's important for a variety of reasons. One, as Dr. King once said, we will either learn to live together as brothers and sisters or perish together as fools. And those of us who are Christian believe in following the way of Jesus. And Jesus was the one who said, blessed are the poor, and blessed are the poor in spirit. That the way we show and live love in a practical way is through our compassion, through our works of justice, through our work of taking care of each other. When Jesus was asked about Judgment Day, which was a way of asking, what does God care about? He said, did you feed me when I was hungry? Did you clothe me when I was naked? All of that parable in Matthew 25, all is about human beings taking care of each other because we are all children of God.
Yeah, indeed. And Bishop Barber, the Episcopal Church, which Bishop Curry leads, has signed on to your Poor People's Campaign, the revival of Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign. You're going to be giving a sermon at the National Cathedral next Sunday, June 3rd. Give us a preview. Since we got the royal family got a preview of Bishop Curry's message, we want a preview of what you intend to say.
Well, part of what I intend to say is what Bishop Curry is saying is actually normative if you follow Jesus. Jesus started out his public ministry saying, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor. And the word poor there, Greek patokos, it means those who've been made poor by policies. So the real question is, with 140 million people in America that are poor and low wealth, what would Jesus say and what would Jesus do in the Congress, not just as a matter of personal charity? 37 million people without health care, what would Jesus say? What would Jesus do? 73 million women and children in poverty, 13 million children that are in poverty, 250,000 people dying every year from low wealth, thousands of people dying without health care in the wealthiest country in the world. What would Jesus say? What would Jesus do? Well, there are 2,000 scriptures in the Bible that says he would be talking about justice, he would talk about poverty, and he would be challenging the systems to build their policies on how you lift the poor. And guess what? If you lift the poor, everybody gets lifted.
Yeah,
that's the way of love. That's the way of love.
Absolutely. And there is a statement that was put out, Bishop Curry and other Christian leaders asserting that the U.S. is in a port of moral crisis. It's called Reclaiming Jesus. I'm going to read one line from it. It says, "We believe Jesus when he tells us to go into all the nations making disciples. Therefore, we reject America first as a theological heresy for followers of Christ." And I'll ask each of you gentlemen, I'll start with you, Bishop Curry. You've directly challenged the theme of the President of the United States, America first. Why? And do you think that his followers will outright reject it because you've done that?
Well, in all honesty, we hope that all people of goodwill and religious traditions and faith will be in conversation with us, because it is our hope that for those of us who are Christian, as an example, we believe that Jesus is Lord. We believe that only God is God. The 10 Commandments say, "I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt have no other gods but me." And if God is God, and if Jesus is Lord, then no ruler, no political authority, no nation, no empire ever in history is Lord. Only God. That's a fundamental truth of our faith. And that's, we love our country. I love this country. But I love God first. And that's what we were saying, that we must never be confused about that order. Because if we truly love our country, we will love God first and follow the ways and teachings of God, the ways of love.
And, you know, Bishop Barber, there is this irony that, you know, Donald Trump's among his strongest supporters are white evangelical Christians who profess to believe the same thing that you gentlemen believe. How can there be that much of a disconnect between two groups of people both calling themselves followers of the same God, the same Bible?
Well, that is a big question, and that's, I would say, some white evangelicals. There are a whole lot that are not, and some of the leadership. The fact of the matter, we've always had this strange reality in America. You know, you had some who believed in slavery and some who didn't. That's why Frederick Douglass on Independence Day said to love the religion of Jesus is to hate the religion of the slave master. It is to say, anytime you try to use faith, particularly the gospel, on the side of greed, on the side of hate, on the side of meanness, we have to stand and say that is not the gospel. That is, in fact, a form of heresy, and it has to be challenged, and we do it in love, and we do it with truth.
Yeah, indeed. Two very dynamic men who are leaders of a moral movement, and we wish you all the success, because, boy, do we need one in this country today. New friend of the show, Bishop Michael Curry, our longtime friend, Bishop William Barber. Thank you both. Thank you both, and, you know, God bless you both. Have a wonderful weekend.
God bless you.
God bless you.
Thank you. More AM Drive after the break.